Welcome everybody to Strongtown's Strong America Tour. Let me just start out and thank a bunch of people that helped make this happen. So our little group that put this together, we call it Strongtown's Annapolis, and we're what I like to term a birds of a feather group. So it's 5 of us that get together and talk about these issues, and when this opportunity came up, we jumped on putting it together. And so the other folks involved are Maka Olson here, Jeremy Olson, Peter Kelgard, and McShane Glover. There's McShane. Okay. And so we're, without those guys, this would have never happened. So thank you guys for being my partner in crime. We have a few sponsors to thank. Can-Be True Value Hardware, Jared Littman contributed. The Commons Annapolis Co-working Space, Jeremy Olson contributed. And perhaps most importantly, you folks who contributed donations through the Eventbrite, we thank you very much. That really is the essence of the Strong Towns thing to do, and we really appreciate that. And also Julian Jack, who is brought his video equipment, so this will be recorded and it'll be available for everybody to look at later and hopefully share with your friends. Okay, so in terms of here, we have, I want to recognize a few people from our county council. Lisa Rodvian is here. 2 former mayors, Dick Hillman and Ellen Moyer. I don't see anybody from the Annapolis current city council. Am I missing anybody? Oh, well, their loss. I want to thank the city staff for coming, and thank the city manager, Teresa Sutherland, for allowing the staff to come here to listen to this. We appreciate that. A few people from citizen committees. The chair of our planning commission, Bob Waldman, is here. Is Bob there? Thank you. And so now I want to turn it over to Gavin Buckley, our current mayor, and to welcome Strong Towns. Thank you, Gavin.
I like looking out in the audience. I feel like I'm in a progressive town. Thank you so much for all being here. I want to thank these guys for putting this on and making this happen. I'm a big fan of Chuck's and Strong Towns. I truly believe that in what the revolution is about. It is mayors, I really think, are going to be the change agents in the country. We are going to be the ones who stand up for the environment, stand up for the arts, stand up for other people. It's really going to start here. We're so polarized nationally. When I go to mayor's conferences, we don't ask each other if you're a Republican or Democrat. We talk about sexy things like trash and parking, but we talk about solutions, and that's what I love about Strong Towns. It's very solution-oriented, and so I learned so much from you. We are honored that you are here with us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, so I also wanted to thank Fox Books for handling the bringing the books and doing the signing. We very much appreciate that, to get a local business over on Maryland Avenue involved. And again, is the Strong Towns thing to do. Okay, so let me introduce Chuck. So I'm just going to quickly, for those of you who are not familiar with him, I'm just going to read just 2 quick paragraphs from his bio, and then say something a little more personal. So Charles Marohn, known as Chuck to his friends and colleagues, is a professional engineer licensed in the state of Minnesota and a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. He's the founder and president of Strong Towns. Marohn has a bachelor's degree in civil engineer from the University of Minnesota's Institute of Technology and a master of urban planning degree from the University of Minnesota's Humphrey Institute. Chuck grew up on a small farm in central Minnesota. The oldest of 3 sons of 2 elementary school teachers, he joined the Minnesota National Guard on his 17th birthday during his junior year of high school and served for 9 years. In addition to being passionate about building a stronger America, he loves playing music, is an obsessive reader, and religiously follows his favorite team, the Minnesota Twins. Chuck and his wife live with their 2 daughters in their hometown of Brainerd, Minnesota. All right, so much for the formal introduction. And I just wanted to say real quick, from a personal standpoint, Chuck is the thought leader of this Strong Towns movement. And, through his writing, and frankly, the writing of the whole Strong Towns community, both the folks that work officially with Strong Towns, but also citizens who contribute writing along those lines, that has had perhaps the most profound impact on how I think about cities and how I approach the problems and the issues that we have here in Annapolis. And we're really pleased to have him here for this discussion. And the five of us hope, and we brought them here because we hope it will provide a framework and change the way the conversation happens about the issues we face here in Annapolis. So with that, take it away, Chuck.
Thank you for being here. We launched a book on October 1st. It's kind of the culmination of a decade of writing and traveling. I'm an engineer, I'm a planner. In 2008, I started to write a blog. It was just 3 days a week. I started to write about the cities that I had worked with, projects I had worked on, really trying to get at the notion of why our cities struggle financially. About a year into that, some friends of mine encouraged me to start a nonprofit. They actually filled out the paperwork and got it going. And a foundation came to us a while after that and gave me 3 years of startup money to leave my planning practice, my engineering practice, and go out and start what has become now Strong Towns. The only thing they asked me is that I go share this message with as many people as I could. And that's what I've been doing ever since. We have, this year we'll have 3 million different people access our website and web content. We now post 2-3 articles a day. We've got 3 different podcast streams. We're doing video. We're trying to change the entire development pattern of North America on a tiny, tiny budget, simply by sharing ideas with people and by having those ideas bounced around and discussed. Come here today and hear that the mayor reads our stuff is very gratifying. So thank you, and thank you to all of you. Our mission as an organization is to support a model of development that allows our cities, towns, and neighborhoods to become financially strong and resilient. The book, as I said, is kind of a synopsis. We always have people who say, give me the elevator speech of Strong Towns. And I realize that the elevator speech is an important thing. I can't do it. Our conversation kind of encompasses so much of human life and cities and the way we live and work together that we really got to the point where we wanted to put a book of kind of all of it in one. So I'm going to give you some highlights of that today and hopefully encourage you to dig deeper on the website and get involved with the Strong Towns group here in town. I'm going to start the conversation the way I end chapter 3, which is talking about Detroit. I've traveled all over the country, and I run into people who want to talk about Detroit. Everybody has a narrative on Detroit. Everybody can explain in their own mind what has happened there and what has gone wrong. When I run into people who have a very strong left of center perspective, they have a complete narrative of what happened in Detroit. It's internally coherent and consistent, but it bears very little resemblance to a narrative of someone who's on the political right. Someone on the political right will have a full narrative of what happened in Detroit. It will be internally consistent and coherent. The only real overlap between these narratives and really all the narratives that I've heard on Detroit is one single point. There's one point of consensus that I pick up nationally on Detroit, and it's this: my city is not Detroit. Whatever happened there, whatever took place there is some weird, strange thing. It's not going to happen here. We are fundamentally different than Detroit. I want to give you my narrative of Detroit. When we go back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, before Henry Ford, before the automobile, and we look at the city of Detroit, what we see is one of the wealthiest cities, not just in North America, but in the world. This is a place of such wealth and grandiose. You can go there today and you can still go to the Detroit Opera House or some of the great theaters, and you'll see buildings that are so opulent, so amazing, that they would be at home in like the greatest capitals in Europe. These are astounding places. And Detroit in the early 1900s was perhaps the wealthiest city in North America. As Detroit was on its way to becoming the Motor City, as they started to experiment with this new technology of the automobile, they were the first city to come up with the idea that people could live on the outskirts of town and drive in by car during the day to work and then turn around and commute back out at the end of the day. They started to build housing subdivisions out on the edge. They started to run highways through and bisect their neighborhoods in order to make this happen. They were the first city to really tear down buildings at mass to convert things into parking lots. And by the time we hit the Great Depression, and cities around the country started to go into bankruptcy and failure and decline, there was one city that stood out for its relative prosperity. That, of course, being Detroit. Detroit continued to grow, albeit modestly, through the Great Depression and World War II. And when we got to the end of the war, and we demobilized troops and we started to create this kind of new idea of how we were going to build America, it was very clear to the nation's mayors and city council members and Rotary Club presidents and vested people in the community what we needed to do to be successful. We needed to copy the development pattern of our wealthiest, most prosperous city, that being Detroit. And that's exactly what we did. We all copied the development pattern pioneered by Detroit. When you take a very wealthy city and you spread it out over a large area, denuding the tax base and adding enormous liabilities, you get Detroit. Like every bankruptcy, it happens very slowly and then all at once. Detroit's not some crazy place. The people there are not any different than us. They're not fundamentally flawed. They've not done something that nobody else has done before. They're simply early. They're simply a couple decades ahead of everybody else. My mom got an advanced copy of the book. And when she got to the end of chapter 3, she called me up and she said, "Chuck, this is really depressing." I said, "Mom, stick with it. It gets better." She did say that it gets better, so stick with it. But I start with Detroit because what we have done is we've taken a very complex adaptive system, which is the Detroit of the pre-automobile era, a complex adaptive system, and we refined it and honed it to be a complicated yet efficient system, a system that is merely complicated, designed to do one very simple thing. Complex adaptive systems are, sometimes we can think of them as like natural ecosystems. When we look at a rainforest, what we're looking at is a complex adaptive system. Each component, each part of the rainforest is able to act on its own independently. They're able to adapt, change, evolve strategies. When we stress the rainforest in one way or another, it's able to adapt and evolve. It doesn't collapse. It doesn't, if a rainforest gets too much rain in one season or too much sun in another season, you might see the plants or the animals adapt to that and grow in different ways, but the whole ecosystem doesn't collapse. It's a complex adaptive system. Its properties are emergent. And so when we look at a rainforest, we see a kind of, consistent pattern across. Yet when we get down at the fractal level, when we get down to the base of it, what we see is this massive amount of diversity. A highly evolved, highly adapted, emergent order. We find it as humans, modern humans, very easy to think of natural ecosystems in this way. The challenge I want to put in front of you tonight is to also look at human habitat in this way. When we look at human habitat of the kind of pre-Depression era, what we are looking at as well is a complex adaptive system, an emergent order. Humans experimented with how to build places. For thousands and thousands of years, they would try things out. What worked, they would keep those ideas, they would copy them, they would pass them along, they would try new things. What we see is cities that would evolve, adapt, emerge. When we think of a bee and a beehive, we understand that the beehive is finely tuned to bring out and optimize the qualities of the bee. The two are, in a sense, co-evolved together. When we look at cities of the past, we need to look at them as complex human habitat co-evolved with us to respond to our needs, to help us be human. These are complex adaptive systems. When we look at a Rube Goldberg machine is very complicated. In fact, the thing that makes them have some uniqueness to them is their complexity. We press a thing over here and all this stuff happens and it comes out on this side over here. It takes very smart people to put together a Rube Goldberg machine. But we understand that if we stress a Rube Goldberg machine, if we cut one of those ropes, if we move something out of the way, the Rube Goldberg machine doesn't evolve and adapt, it simply breaks, it stops working. Your automobile engine is a very complicated machine. If it takes a lot of brain power, a lot of intelligence to put together an automobile engine. But if your automobile engine is stressed, if it's subjected to stress and pressure and we put it through the ringer, it doesn't become a toaster. It just stops being an automobile engine. It is, in a sense, fragile. It will not adapt, it will not evolve, it will not change and emerge a new order in response to stress. It will only break. When we look at the difference between complex and complicated systems, this is what we're talking about. Complex systems respond to stress by adaptation. When we get to systems that are merely complicated, yes, they require a lot of brain power. Yes, they require a lot of smarts and know how to run. But when subjected to stress, they don't evolve, they don't adapt, they don't change. When the rainforest gets too much sun, different plants start to take over and grow. It will change, it will adapt. When the cornfield gets too much sun, you don't magically get soybeans, you just get bad corn. This is the difference between a complex and a complicated system. We see the same things when it comes to cities. We take a system that is complex when it is subject to stress, when markets change, when human tendencies change, when we go through times of scarcity or times of abundance, when we go through times of war or peace or what have you. This system can evolve, adapt, new properties can emerge out of it, new orders can be created. When we look at systems that are merely complicated, that lack that fundamental capacity to adapt, there's only one ultimate endpoint, and that is failure. Every complicated system ultimately fails. By its very nature, it's unable to adapt, unable to evolve. That automobile engine does not morph into a toaster. The only thing that will ultimately happen to that engine is it will stop being an engine. This is a huge shift in how we built cities. When we look at that emergent order, what we're seeing is this wisdom of our ancestors. And I say the word ancestors in the largest possible sense of the word. Humans for around the world, different continents, different latitudes, different cultures, for thousands and thousands of years, experimented with how to build their habitat. When we look at how this habitat is built and emerges, we see a very simple, yet kind of in aggregate, a very spooky approach to passing on this wisdom. This is the way every city that was ever founded prior to our new kind of experimental way of building, this is how every single city began. This happens to be my hometown. I live in Brainerd, Minnesota. It's a couple hours north of Minneapolis, St. Paul. This is what it looked like back in 1870. But if we went back to the earliest iteration of Annapolis, what would we see? We would have seen a city that looked just like this. Some poor people built some little pop-up shacks. They had some hopes and some dreams about the future. Baltimore started like this. Philadelphia started like this. Manhattan began like this. Go back in time. London, Rome, Cairo, Alexandria, Paris, they all began like this. Some pop-up shacks, some hopes, and some dreams. We built thousands of these across North America, just like this. And for a variety of complex reasons, reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even to fully understand after the fact, a lot of these places failed. What happens when a place like this fails? Does the stock market crash? Does unemployment skyrocket? Do we have to have an emergency session of Congress to bail out Wall Street banks? Of course not. We all understand what this is. This is a little bet. A few people lose a little bit. They salvage what they can. They move on to the next place. We built thousands of places just like this, all across North America. And for a variety of complex reasons, reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even to fully understand after the fact, a lot of these places were successful. And when they were successful, when more and more people began to gather in this place, when the place started to build some momentum, we would see the underlying land values increase, driving this natural redevelopment pressure, and the place would start to grow. It would grow incrementally up, incrementally out, and become incrementally more intense. After 30 years, this little street of pop-up shacks would become this street here. And just like a culture in a petri dish grows, not all in one direction at once or all up at once, it grows kind of in a tempered pattern, incrementally out, incrementally up, become incrementally more intense. Ultimately, after another 4 decades, these 2- and 3-story wood structures would become buildings of brick and granite. This is that emergent order. This is that complex human habitat. A place adapting and evolving, responding to stresses and opportunities, harmonizing many different things across time in a complex human habitat. Let me pause here and just note, I'm not suggesting that these places were perfect, not by any stretch of the imagination. Complex adaptive systems are never perfect. That's the whole point. The stress is actually realized, and the adaptation comes because we're actually trying to overcome and deal with and harmonize many, many competing things. After World War II, we switched to a system that was merely complicated, a system that was designed to do very few things but do them incredibly well. Here's what this same street looks like now. It is a half-occupied buildings and parking lot strip. And if you grasp in one photo why our cities struggle financially to make ends meet, in that little stretch of street right there, those 2 blocks, there's $500,000 of community investment in the roads, the streets, the curb, the sidewalk. Where's the wealth that's going to sustain that investment? Decade after decade after decade. It's not there. It's gone. I feel it's very important. And I do this with generosity. I feel it's very important for us to look back at the people before us and the decisions they made and apply as much generosity to what they did as possible. And I say that because I know for a fact that we are screwing things up really bad. And I know that we're also good people trying to do good things. I hope that my kids, my grandkids, and future generations look back at us with generosity because we're human and we're struggling in the same way. When we look at the humans that made this shift from complex to merely complicated, it's important to understand what they were doing. My grandfather lived through the Great Depression. He was a teenager. I talked to him. I read about him a little bit in the book. When he was a kid, for some reasons I don't really fully understand, he was not able to live at home. I think his family just couldn't afford it. He wound up moving in with a farmer, and the farmer would feed him and allow him to sleep in the barn. This is Minnesota, so allowed him to sleep in the barn And in exchange, he would work on the farm. And that's what he did for part of his teenage years. My grandfather was in the Marines in World War II. He was one of the first troops into Nagasaki after they dropped the bomb. He was part of this generation that experienced enormous amount of stress during the Depression, and then fought these, global threats to our very existence. When we look at this period of time, it's important for us to note that no one understood what caused the Great Depression. Even today, we don't have consensus on what caused it. You can read economists and they'll have, here's what caused the Great Depression, and you'll read it and you're like, well, that makes sense. And then there'll be another economist who say, here's what caused the Great Depression, and it's the exact opposite. And you'll read that and you go, well, that makes sense. It was a complex adaptive system, the economy, that broke. It fell apart, it stopped working. It evolved to something else. And the whole New Deal project was just an attempt to try to find something that would work to get it going again. Nobody really knew why it broke. No one really knew how to fix it. Let's try this, let's try that. The only thing that got us back to the macro conditions of growth was World War II. When we could take everyone who was working age and capable, send them overseas to fight and die, and then we took everybody else and brought them into factories building boats and tanks and munitions that we were just going to blow up, we could get everybody working again. That life of austerity, that life of sacrifice, yes, it met all the macro conditions. We had GDP growth, we had low unemployment, but nobody called that prosperity. Nobody was thinking that this is like now we've reached the ultimate. And so when it became clear that we were going to win the war, when it became clear that we would defeat Germany, that we would defeat Japan, and it was only a matter of time and how many lives and how much material it would cost, the economists advising the president and our leadership started to ask some really hard questions. This is actually a quote from Paul Samuelson, one of the president's chief economic advisors. And Samuelson was convinced, as were many other people, that once we brought all these troops home, once we shut down the industry, that America was just going to slide right back into depression. There was nothing fundamentally different about our economy that would keep this from happening. Why would it not? This is a very logical thought. Of course, we have the gift of hindsight, right? We know what happened after World War II. We didn't slide right back into depression. What did we do? We did this. We built a new version of America. In our victory, as the only major industrial power not decimated by war, we took the industrial capacity we had all the oil, we had the gold, we had the world's reserve currency. We took all this might and we said, we are going to solve the existential problems that we have dealt with as humans for all of eternity. The major problem that humans have always dealt with, and you can go read the Old Testament and you'll see it again and again. How do you split one loaf of bread between two hungry people? This is a problem that we've always struggled with. How do you split a loaf of bread between two hungry people? We solved it. We solved it by creating a second loaf, and a third loaf, and a fourth loaf. The faster we could grow our economy, the more prosperity we could create. That prosperity we could distribute naturally through whatever means to help benefit society, solve these problems, all the tensions in our cities, whether it's congestion or bad air or bad sanitation, we could go fix right now for all time. We could give everybody a little plot of land. We could live in a utopia. You had a country united in a common enemy, now turning and uniting in a common vision towards recreating a brand new way of living. And that's what they did. And it was wildly successful. I mean, I think that's the thing that we look back at today and we still nostalgize the 50s and 60s as this golden era. In our last presidential election, we had two 70-year-old candidates. And if you listen to them closely, what they were telling us was, here's my vision for the future. It is a return to the past, the best period of time in my 7-year-old life. We can recreate that again. Whether that past was Ozzie and Harriet families and blue-collar jobs, or whether that past was a government that could do things like the Great Society and urban renewal and expansion of Medicare. Whatever the vision was, they were talking about the exact same period of time, that 2 decades of prosperity after World War II, when growth provided us the opportunity to go in and fix all these problems. And this system grows. When we centralize our road and street construction standards, we centralize our building codes, we centralize and make efficient our zoning codes, we create secondary markets for housing and commercial real estate. What we have done is we've created this machine that allows us to grow very, very, very quickly. Here's Fresno, California, which I use because I've got good maps, but really, like most cities, you'll see this exact same pattern. Here's the growth of Fresno, California before World War II. This is that incremental, complex, adaptive system growing incrementally up, incrementally out, and becoming incrementally more intense. Now we hit World War II, and we have a completely different system, one that removes the complexity to focus in a hyper way on how do we grow as a mechanism to solve these other larger problems. And here's what we experienced. At the end of World War II, my little town was 13,500 people. Today, my little city is 13,500 people, but it's 10 times the size. This pattern grows very quickly, but it has other effects because we're not harmonizing competing interests. We're not experiencing the stress the way we used to. We're not having to fix things as we go. This is data from Lafayette, Louisiana, where we did a large study. What we see in a city like Lafayette is that between the end of World War II and today, the population has grown 3.5 times. A massive increase from a little over 30,000 people to now a little over 120,000. But when we look at something like their water system, what we see is that at the end of World War II, it took 5 feet of pipe per person to provide water service in the city of Lafayette. Today it's 10 times that, 50 feet of pipe. We can look at their fire suppression system, their hydrants. And what we see is that at the end of World War II, it was 2.3 hydrants per person. Now it's 21 times that. Yes, we've grown very quickly. Our population has grown an enormous amount. We've been able to add new stuff, new people, new area, and grow. But our liabilities have grown in a massive amount. While our liabilities have grown 10 times, 20 times, this would be acceptable, in a sense, if we were becoming wealthier and more prosperous in the process. But when we step back and we say, how are the families of Lafayette doing? What we see is that while our liabilities grow 10 times and 20 times, our family wealth has hardly grown at all. When we look at our families, what we see is that we're taking on larger amounts of debt than ever. We are experiencing lower rates of savings than ever. We're seeing, for the vast majority of Americans, their net worth stagnate or decline over stretches of decades now. This pattern creates growth, yes, but it does not generate wealth. It's not making us more prosperous. And while the growth is helpful for solving immediate problems, over time what we see is that our communities have become overwhelmed with liabilities, overwhelmed with promises, whether it's pensions that we promised years ago we would pay because in the future we would be so wealthy, or whether it's all the miles of road and street and pipe and sidewalk and pipes and pumps and valves and buildings, all this stuff that we built, believing the sun would always be shining. And even when it has been shining, because we've not had that feedback, we've grown, and we've grown ourselves into insolvency. This is the struggle that we have now. It's not a struggle of how do we create more growth. It's a struggle of how do we go back and make better use of the stuff we've already built. Let me show you what this looks like on the ground, what we have done, what this kinetic growth strategy has created. This is a neighborhood in my hometown. I'm gonna have you focus on these 2 blocks here. If you look at them, you'll see they're the same area. They have the same amount of public infrastructure. They're the same size. They're on the same thoroughfare, the same neighborhood. Everything about them is the same except for the style of development. In the 1920s, as my city was growing incrementally, these 3 blocks were the next increment of out. So what you're looking at is the development that would have been on the far edge of town. That block on the right, on the left over here, those are the pop-up shacks. That's what they would have looked like. You're looking at the cheapest commercial building you would have built on the far edge of town. And had the city continued to grow in the way that it historically had done, as cities around the world had grown for thousands of years, what would we expect to see? Ultimately, the land would have become more valuable as more people collected there. It would have become more of a place. That rising land value would have created a natural redevelopment pressure. We would have expected the buildings on there to ultimately get 2nd and 3rd stories, become more intense, more ornate. That's not what happened. These were built in the 20s, then we had the Great Depression, then we had World War II, then we just skipped right over these buildings and started building hyper out on the edge. These 3 blocks have stagnated for almost a century now. That block on the right used to look just like the one on the left. We got it torn down. We labeled it Blight. Those buildings are gone, and now we got the new Taco John's drive-through. You're going to come to Brainerd someday, and we'll go to Taco John's. But you've never been to Taco John's, right? We're in a big enough room. Someone here has gone to Taco John's, right? Yes. You're the only one confessing to this. Oh, you're from Iowa. Beautiful. Where in Iowa?
By Ames.
Oh, by Ames. Okay. What's Taco John's known for?
Really cheap, gross Mexican food.
Oh, come on. What's the delicacy of Taco John's?
Wasn't it a 6-pack and a pound for like?
Yeah, they had those. That's the volume discount, though. That's the potato olays.
Yeah.
Yes, right? I think the thing that sets Taco John's apart from other quality establishments in the Mexican food realm is the potato ole. The potato ole is a.
Sorry.
Why are you laughing at this?
It's funny.
It's a tater tot, right? You have tater tots, you know. Okay, this is a tater tot like cut in thirds, so it's more like a chip kind of thing, fried, lots and lots of salt, right? And then dipped in a mild cheddar cheese dip, exactly like they do in Mexico, right? It's like a Norwegian take on Mexican food, right? So we got a brand new Taco John's. We were thrilled about this, absolutely thrilled. This building got rid of blight. It met all the requirements of the zoning code. We've got the right floor area ratios. We got the right parking lot requirements. We've got the right sign. The environmentalists showed up and got them to put native plants in the stormwater area back there. The bike walk people wanted a sidewalk, so they got them to put a sidewalk in. The sidewalk ends right there, but they got that stretch. In our development pattern, this checked every single box we had. This was looked at as a huge, huge success. Here's what nobody bothered to look at. That old blighted rundown block had a total value of $1.1 million. That shiny and new, it's the same size, the same area, it costs the public, the community, the same to provide ongoing service and maintenance, is only worth $600,000. Understand what you're looking at. You're looking at the traditional pattern of development, that complex, emergent human habitat evolved over thousands and thousands of years. You're looking at it in its infant phase after almost a century of decline and neglect. And it still outperforms by a wide margin the stuff we build brand new today. It's not even close. This is not an isolated case. This is a pattern we see over and over and over. A good friend of mine named Joe Minicozy runs a firm out of Asheville, North Carolina called Urban 3. Urban 3 does financial modeling for cities. They have modeled thousands of cities around the world. And what we see is the same spooky pattern emerge over and over and over. This is Buffalo, New York. Buffalo, New York is a city that has experienced decline ever since the end of World War II. It's been a steady drop of population. They lost population last year. This is a very poor place with a lot of disinvestment. I happen to love Buffalo. I think it's a great, great city, but they've suffered a lot. What I'm going to show you right now is the financial productivity of Buffalo. Where is the land that you get the highest productivity from? Think of productivity, think of a cornfield. The parts of the field that grow up the most robustly, we say that's the most productive part of the field. That's where we get the most bushels per acre. Well, where in Buffalo do we have the most productive land? Where do we get the most value per acre? Can you point to the traditional downtown? Can you identify that complex adaptive environment, that evolved human habitat that emerged prior to the Great Depression? Not only is it a massive repository of wealth, but it absolutely dwarfs in performance everything that's come since. This is something we see over and over and over. They've modeled thousands of cities. We see the same thing. Here's a mid-sized city in upstate New York, same pattern. Here's a city in New Hampshire, same thing. Bozeman, Montana. Brevard, North Carolina. I could show you hundreds of these. It's the same thing over and over. Here's a little town by where I live. When I first went to this place, they said, Chuck, we've got some wonderful stuff happening out here, got some great stuff happening out here, but these neighborhoods through here are just terrible. We got to figure out how to get some of this stuff torn down and rebuilt. And then we showed them where all their wealth is. In those poor neighborhoods. In those neighborhoods where all the poor people live. We created, after World War II, a set of conditions that allowed our economy to grow very, very fast. And that growth has helped us solve many, many problems. And when we look today at our conversation, we have this obsession with growth. We must grow. Our economy has to achieve a certain amount of GDP expansion every year. In 2008, when our economy started to just slow down, not go into decline, but just slow down a little bit, it created a catastrophe. We must grow. And the tragic situation we've created ourselves is that growth once served us, but now we find ourselves in service of growth, of this model that's making us less stable, less wealthy, and less prosperous. When we recognize this, that more growth is not going to help us, not in this pattern, not in this model, that simply further expansion, further denuding, more Taco Johns is actually going to make us poorer over time. We have to start looking at our systems and saying, okay, how do we do something different? How do we take what we've already built and wring more value out of it? How do we take the resources we have and try to recreate that complex, adaptable human habitat environment, those positive feedback loops, so that we can actually get more wealth, more prosperity out of the resources that we already have? The subtitle of our book is A Bottom-Up Revolution to Rebuild American Prosperity. Because like the mayor said when we started out today, this is not about the big fancy project. It's not about the big glitzy thing we can do that will then trickle down to prosperity. It's about things like garbage and fixing sidewalks and maintaining crosswalks and taking good care of streetlights and making small things happen so that this emaciated framework we have built starts to get some meat on the bones, starts to thicken up, starts to become prosperous and successful and responsive to human needs. I want to talk about how we start to make that shift. There's a saying out of Silicon Valley about innovation that I find to be really helpful. It goes like this: innovation that happens from the top down tends to be orderly but dumb, while innovation that happens from the bottom up tends to be chaotic but smart. If we ask people, they will say, I have a preference for smart over dumb. Yet in an affluent society, we have an overwhelming preference for order over chaos. We will tolerate an astronomical amount of dumb so that we maintain order. If you doubt me, think of the last time you sat at a traffic signal at 1 in the morning. We have an enormous preference for order over chaos. We have very little tolerance for chaos, experimentation, messiness. And that is because we are an affluent society. If you visit places that are less affluent, even in North America, if you go to a place like Detroit or Buffalo or Memphis or Shreveport, and you experience places that are less affluent or struggle more with poverty, what you'll see from the affluent eyes is messiness, chaos. What you're witnessing is a complex adaptive feedback loop. People hacking things, people figuring things out. For people not used to this, it's disorienting, it's scary. If we want to experience smart innovation, if we want our cities to actually become places with feedback loops where we're learning, we're adapting, we're evolving, we're responding to the needs of humans, we have to learn to tolerate not chaos, we're not talking Gotham City, but a little bit of messiness at the block level, at the neighborhood level. This is another one of those maps, but this one's a little bit different. This is a map of Lafayette, Louisiana. And instead of being a financial productivity, this one is actually, you can think of as a profit and loss map. We went to Lafayette, Louisiana and looked at every expense that the city had. We looked at where their street maintenance expenses were, where the sewer and water system expenses were, how they did drainage. We looked at where their transit system went, their police and fire department. We looked at all these expenses and we mapped them all up. Then we looked at every source of revenue the city had. Where they're getting their property tax from, where's their sales tax coming from, their permit, their utility fees and all this. We mapped all those up. At the end, we mashed them all together into this profit and loss map. Everywhere where you see a blue property, you're seeing a property that pays more in taxes and fees annually to the city than they require in ongoing service and maintenance. Everywhere where you see red, it's the exact opposite. These are places that actually cost more to provide service and maintenance to than they generate in revenue. You know what's going on here now. I've shown you a bunch of these examples. The blue here in the middle is the core downtown. This crescent of blue right here, those are the poorest neighborhoods in the community. Here's what these places look like. In the upper right side there, you see the core downtown. They would love to have your core downtown. That's what they aspire to. They're working hard on theirs. Theirs is getting better, but it's got a long ways to go. You can see, no one goes to Lafayette and takes pictures of the downtown and puts them on postcards, right? It's getting better. Financially, it's doing fantastic. It's really, really profitable for the community. From the eye test, not so well. That crescent of blue, that bottom right picture is kind of a representative photo from that neighborhood. The neighborhood, from an eye test, really, really struggles. When we were going there to get an Airbnb, the city staff told us, stay away from those neighborhoods. That's where the homicides happen, the burglaries happen, don't go there. These places really, really struggle, yet financially, they're doing fantastic. And by the way, our financial analysis assumes that the city is actually out there doing the things that they said they do, maintaining the roads, mowing the ditches, doing this stuff. The fact that they're not, and they're clearly not throughout most of these places, just means that our model is actually underrepresenting the amount of profit they're making. These neighborhoods are extremely profitable for the community, even if they were properly maintained. All that red stuff, it's the malls, the strip malls, the big box stores, the franchise drive-through restaurants, the windy streets with the cul-de-sacs, the 3-car garages with the attached house. It's that stuff there.
Can you explain?
Yeah, I will.
No, can you explain what you mean by the community profiting from these neighborhoods? I'm not sure I understand.
What do I mean by the community profiting? What I mean is that the city, here's how I look at cities. We can talk about state government and federal government. They're distant things for me. The city is us. It's how we take action. If you live in a city, you are in a sense a shareholder in a municipal corporation. And you are electing a chair and a board of directors to run your municipal corporation. As a shareholder in that municipal corporation, the most profitable investments we have in this city is that stuff on the right, that stuff in blue. When we spend $1 in those neighborhoods to provide police and fire protection, to provide sewer and water service, to maintain the roads and the streets and the sidewalks, we get way more than $1 back. When we spend $1 in the red neighborhoods doing the same service, we get far less than $1 back. That's what I mean by profitable or not profitable for the community. Does that answer your question?
Are you talking about taxes back? I mean, the revenue you're talking.
Some of it's taxes, some of it's utility fees, some of it's, there's lots of different ways cities collect revenue.
I'm missing something here.
Okay.
The city exists for the people,
Right?
but you're acting as if, or not acting, you're speaking about a situation in which the people that live in the poor neighborhoods are losing in their own neighborhoods.
Yes, let me say this emphatically. In Lafayette, Louisiana, as in most cities that we've looked at, this is only not true in highly gentrified places. What we see is the poor neighborhoods subsidize the wealthy neighborhoods. Yes, that is a common shared experience across North America. Let me give you some numbers here for Lafayette. The median family in Lafayette pays $1,500 a year in taxes to the city. In order to maintain everything that they built, in order to fix every pipe, every road, every sidewalk, median taxes in Lafayette, Louisiana need to go from $1,500 a year to $9,200 a year. 1 out of every $5 a family makes needs to be returned to the city just to maintain what they've already built. That won't happen. There's no possible way that can happen. And so, despite all this growth, all this stuff that they've built, at some point, that huge backlog of road maintenance is going to cease being a backlog that we're promising we'll get to next year or the year after the year after. And Lafayette's going to have to decide, this road we maintain, this road we let go bad. This pipe we repair, this pipe we don't. What does this sound like? It sounds like Detroit, right? A bankruptcy that happens very slowly and then all at once. Lafayette has built a lot of stuff. The developer comes in and says, I'll build the subdivision, I'll build all the sewer, water, roads, I'll pay for all this. It's all brand new, I'll give it to you, the city, to maintain. The city says, great. Because what happens then is we get all those transaction fees, we get all the revenue from the new properties, and all we have to do is 30 years from now go out and fix the road. But when you don't create enough wealth off of that investment, when you get there 30 years later, you don't have the money. So what does a city like Lafayette do? Let's grow some more. And let's grow some more and grow some more and grow some more. You don't make up for insolvency by increasing the volume of sales, right? If you lose money, it's a business. If you lose money on every transaction you do, you don't make it up in volume. Over time, you run out of room. You run out of runway, right? That's what we're seeing in our cities. We can grow very, very, very quickly because we exchange cash today for long-term liabilities. Well, we live in the long term now. Go ahead.
what accounts for the difference? Is it the?
Oh, I'm going to get to that. Is that your question too?
Is it density?
No, No, and I think that's what, okay, so I'm a planner, and planners would look at this and they're like, oh, it's all density. No, it's not. No, it's not. We can go to dense places and we don't see this pattern. So it's not a density thing. It's not a density thing. I'm gonna tell you, go ahead.
Can you clarify when you say growth, that it's like expansion, is what you're talking about with growth?
Growth in the way we do it today. Largely expansion, also the Taco John's variety. The growth that focused more on the number of transactions. It's become financialized, and I think financialization is a...
I said Los Angeles.
Oh, Los Angeles. In a sense, yes. Yes. I think, well, let me put it this way. Yeah. Let me put it this way. No, we're fine. I would do this for hours. I love this stuff so much. It's so important. Oftentimes when we ask, like, what's the big difference between pre-depression development and post-war development? People will say it's the automobile. And that's kind of the Los Angeles thing, is like they built around the automobile. It's not the automobile. We can go around the world to different places where they have the automobile and they do not have the North American development pattern. Our development pattern is unique. What is unique about it is that prior to the Great Depression, and in other parts around the world today, what we see is that cities are built incrementally on a continuum of improvement. They're always evolving, always adapting in an incremental way. Here, we build things all at once, and we build them to a finished state. We have the godlike hubris to believe that when we build something, it is done. It has reached its final form. It is completed. We are the only society in all of human history to have such belief in our own skills that we build something and the people who come after us and after them will say, this is now perfect, it's done. That's the big difference. So when we look at the Taco John's, when we look at this stuff on the left, it's not designed to adapt or evolve or change. There's no mechanism in the zoning code or the building code or the way these mortgages are financed or anything like that that has any anticipation of anything else than what's there now continuing indefinitely. That's the big difference. Please.
So is it just that the parts of the town?
Are you asking me why this map is this
Well,
way?
no, it's more dynamic.
Oh, I'm going to get to that.
Oh, okay.
Could you infer people in a poor neighborhood are stressing the city less because they live closer to where they
I'm going to
live?
get to that.
Okay.
So you all are inquisitive. You're like, why is this map? This doesn't look anything like what we think it should look. Why is this happening? What we've been led to believe is that these poor neighborhoods are sucking up all the wealth and resources, and it's the wealthy places out on the edge that we got to pursue because the tax base is so much better. You're telling us that up is down, left is right. No. First of all, I'm going to disappoint you because I'm asked all the time to explain why is this way? And my answer is, it's spooky. It's complex. It defies one explanation. And I say that because we've modeled thousands of places and they're very different from each other and they all have the same, very similar pattern. When we see neighborhoods that were built before the Great Depression, they tend to outperform neighborhoods that were built after World War II. When we see neighborhoods that are more walkable and bikeable, they tend to outperform financially the neighborhoods that are more auto-oriented. There's a few of these general trends we see. But this is the result of this complex, adaptive, spooky system. Let me give you a couple things that we found in Lafayette. And these are things that happen in some places, but not in others. But I'll give you Lafayette. We found in those blue neighborhoods in the lower right, we found places where the sewage would come from the house in a small pipe, flow into a larger pipe, flow by gravity down to a lift pump, where it was then pumped out to the sewage treatment plant. We then found neighborhoods in the red area where the sewage would run out of the house in a small pipe into a larger pipe, go down to a lift pump where it was then pumped over 20 times through a succession of lengths of pipe until it got to the same sewage treatment facility. Both of those properties are considered one house. They both provide the same amount of revenue because they're both paying the same bill to the city every month. So the revenue's the same, but the expenses are vastly different. They're way, way different. The one has very little expense at all. The other one has this massive ongoing amount of expense. Okay, there's one data point. If you're poor and you move to Lafayette, and understand that every city that was ever founded was founded by poor people, where would you have built? Lafayette's a swamp. Where would you build if you were poor? You'd build on the high ground. Why? Because God is very generous about draining land on high ground, right? Like God's going to help you keep your house dry. So when we look at that blue neighborhood, you know what that is? It's a lot of the high ground. It doesn't cost much to drain. A lot of that stuff in red is like drained swamp. There's pumps running all the time to keep those big sheetrock palaces from getting inundated with water. That costs a lot of money, a ridiculous amount of money. I'll give you another one. There's a great book by some psychologists called Cognitive Architecture. They've gone out and studied human development patterns, and they've looked at the way people interact with cities on a human level. They introduced me to this term called thigmotaxis. Thigmotaxis is a Greek word that describes the propensity to hug walls. Jane Jacobs talked about humans as wall-loving creatures. If you read the Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander, he talks about humans' propensity to walk near edges, walk near walls. If you think about a mouse scurrying across a room, they'll tend to scurry along the edge of the wall. They'll avoid the middle. The same with a deer along the edge of a field. They'll hug the edges. They kind of try to stay out of the middle. If you look at microbes under a microscope, what you'll see is that they have a random pattern to their movement until you put a metal rod in the petri dish, and then this very spooky thing happens. They line up along the edge of the wall and they start to travel in a similar direction. Darwin called evolution a conservative process. And by that he meant we conserve strategies that are winning strategies and we pass them on and build off of them. So at some point in our ancient past, and maybe our primordial past, it was a beneficial strategy to stick close to the wall. And so that very fact, when we're near a wall, something in our deep brain stems is subliminally comforting to us. Look at these pictures now. Look at that core downtown. What do you see? Walls. You see an edge condition. It's like satisfying this urge that we all have in the stem of our brains, right? Look at that poor neighborhood in the bottom right. The buildings are all lined up. There's a lot of gaps so they don't form walls. But now think to yourself, this is emergent human habitat, right? Think of the bee and the beehive. They're made to be together. Think of this street and humans. What would happen had this thing continued? The buildings would have become more intense, more ornate. They would have started to thicken up, fill in. You would have got a little addition here, a little addition there. And ultimately, over time, what would you have had? You would have had an edge condition. You would have had a wall. This is spooky stuff. These places are designed with us in mind. They're designed to comfort and help us and benefit us in just weird, weird ways. Please.
One variable to particularly the periphery of the outside of some of these urban areas is, can you touch on redlining and...
Will I?
Redlining?
No, did you say will I touch on it?
Yeah, I mean, could you, in respect to how some of these neighborhoods ended up the way they are and why? So the wall theory is really good, but also understanding some people didn't have the choice.
Totally.
As to like where they would live, so they ended up in these areas which created this problem.
Yes, after World War II, we created, as I said, we created this kinetic growth strategy, the strategy designed to grow our economy as fast as possible. One of the ways we found that it was easier to grow or to grow more quickly, because that was our obsession, the people who were going to resist us less were the people who were the most disenfranchised. So we went and put highways through the middle of their neighborhoods. We put lines on maps that said, we're going to concentrate the federal investments here in the, quote, good neighborhoods where it's going to have the greatest return. And we're going to deny the other neighborhoods that same investment because, and if you read some of the documents, they'll say, because the return was less. They couch it all in financial terms. Absolutely. What we did, and I think, we see this tragically in neighborhoods that I think were on their way to becoming prosperous. We see that this had a huge pernicious effect because we kind of like kneecap these places. And we said you can't participate in what everyone else is participating in. And so we're just gonna make you stay here and atrophy in place. And that was all part of the strategy. It's absolutely pernicious. I do think, and it's very interesting because the redlining conversation has become much more mature now. I think we're understanding more of some of these systems. I do think it's interesting to note that the most optimistic people about this growth strategy, at least they gave lip service to the notion that, yes, we may be growing places for these people today, and these people over here are not benefiting, but ultimately everyone will benefit. And yeah, and I think that was the theory, right? Is that like if we raise the boat, it will, raise it. If we raise the tide, it will raise everyone's boat. And I think by flipping the system around from being bottom up to being very top down, it empowered these. You can almost see, and I think this is the pernicious part about it, you can almost see how decent, thoughtful people could make, or at least wrap the veneer of respectability around those decisions when it was done from that direction. Does that make sense? Let me give you, go ahead. We're just gonna run out of time for any questions at the end, but it's cool, I'm good with this.
Would you agree where you said walls are natural, we tend to do that because they're comforting, we walk close. So is it also, on the picture on the bottom right, we also need the spatial boundaries between us?
Yeah, I just give you one example. I can stand up here for 2 hours and talk about urban, like some of the things. Read that book, Cognitive Architecture, it'll blow your mind. Because I mean, just the fact that they get into, you look at that on the left, where there's no walls, there's no edge condition, there's no point of reference on the street. Oftentimes you'll go in the old parts of town and you'll see there'll be a grand building at the end that the street kind of frames. The walls actually create space and gives it that sense of place. They're not too close together where you get too tight. They're not too far apart where you lose the edge. There's a bunch of little like subliminal things in the way we lay these places out that you're never taught in engineering school, you're never taught in planning school. It literally is evolved wisdom, we call it spooky wisdom, that was handed down to people, and they didn't know this stuff either. They just know, here's how you build places that work. When we look at things like social anxiety, depression, all these maladies that we now suffer from in greater amounts, and we really can't put our finger on, okay, we live in places that are absolutely disorienting for us. Very different than, think of the bees again. Take a beehive, and what if we went in the beehive and we said, these bees are just, they're struggling, there's tension in here. You know what, if they just had some bee cul-de-sacs and some alone time and maybe a bee frontage road or a little bee shopping mall, what would we expect the bees to do? They'd become anxious, they wouldn't work because they're designed to interact a certain way, right? They're bees, we're humans. I think we disrespect that. If you're a very poor person building a street, you would tend to build your house narrow and deep. And the reason you would do that is because you were going to be sharing the costs of maintaining all this stuff with a whole bunch of other people around you. And if you made your house narrow, you would actually have less resources that you were drawing from like the community and more that you were benefiting in return. Let's say now that you're not worried about that. All you're worried about is growth. You're not worried about all those little nuance. You just want to build as fast as possible. What happens to the house? It just rotates. Instead of becoming narrow and deep, it becomes shallow and wide. This is how we go from 5 feet of pipe per person to 50 feet of pipe per person. At this point, we're not worried about how we're going to maintain stuff, how we're going to come up with the wealth to do that, how we lay things out so that it endures and evolves. We're really just interested in how quickly we can grow. Here's a couple buildings that are kind of the apex of our development pattern today. You've got a Kmart at $384,000 an acre, a Walmart at $967,000. These are, like I said, like the pinnacle of what we build. If we go to the downtown in the same community, here's an old abandoned warehouse, now converted into a supper club, $5 million an acre. And here's my favorite, the Jimmy's Pizza, $3.4 million an acre. Once we fully grasp that our cities are this kind of emaciated framework, this framework that really needs to thicken up, we start to ask a different set of questions. If you go out in your neighborhoods today, and instead of driving by at 20 miles, 30 miles, 50 miles an hour, where the world goes past you, you get out and walk, and you experience it at this level, what you're going to become familiar with very quickly, and it will become grotesque to you at a certain point, is the massive amount of gaps in our current system. Our cities are nothing but gaps. Huge, huge gaps. And when you walk down a street, if it's a street with road, pavement, and sidewalks and curb and manhole covers and fire hydrants, you're walking down something that's costing $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a foot to put in the ground. Walk along and do that math. $3,000, $6,000, $9,000, $12,000, and then look at what's there. For the most part, there's going to be nothing there. Nothing at all. Now look at Jimmy's Pizza again. When we look at those gaps, those massive, massive gaps, that's what success looks like now. Jimmy's feels beneath us. It feels like the lowest thing we can, the lowest thing we want. We feel like we can't celebrate Jimmy's because Jimmy's is not what we're after. What we're after, what we will go to the grand opening for is this, right? This is what success looks like. Jimmy's is what success looks like. If we just went out today and filled in every gap we had with a Jimmy's Pizza, look at the massive wealth we would create with no additional cost. Jimmy's isn't beneath us. Jimmy's is like the first iteration of success. When you're very, very poor, people built things like that. That's the first thing they built as a stepping stone to building other things. Well, hello, we're very, very poor now too. We like to live like we're not poor, but when we run the balance sheets, we are functionally insolvent. We're a very poor civilization now. We have to start looking at Jimmy's Pizza not as something beneath us, but as success. To do this, to get that meat back on the bones, we have to, like I said earlier, tolerate a little bit of chaos at the bottom-up level. This looks like this. We need to allow the next increment of intensity, always and everywhere, by right. By right is a kind of a planner speak term. What I mean by right is that you should be able to go in at 9 a.m. with a completed permit application, walk out of City Hall by noon with a permit to build. If you have a single family home, you should be able to turn that single family home into a duplex with the minimum amount of friction possible. You shouldn't have to go to the Planning Commission and beg. You shouldn't have to go grovel in front of your neighbors. You shouldn't have 6 months of review process. If we want our neighborhoods to thicken up, the next increment of intensity needs to be as frictionless as possible. That's that evolutionary adaptation. We have a thought that goes along with this that balances this out. No neighborhood should experience radical change. No neighborhood should be exempt from change. What we have decided is acceptable in today's development pattern is we're going to say 90% of your neighborhoods we're going to put under glass. We're not going to allow them to evolve, change, or adapt. We're going to treat them as simple machines, just live and exist there. And then what's going to happen is we're going to take 10% of our neighborhoods and they're going to experience just radical amounts of change. They're going to be completely unrecognizable a decade from now. And then when whatever of that 90% goes into failure and decline, we'll go in next and we'll flood that area with capital and try to completely transform that overnight as well. This is building all at once to a finished state, over and over. It's actually making our cities weaker, non-adapting. What we need to do is have low levels of growth. We need to have modest incremental growth over a broad area over a long period of time. Allow every neighborhood to adapt and evolve and change. No radical shifts overnight. No massive infusions of capital to completely transform a neighborhood. We need if we want our cities to grow strong and healthy and have that adaptable framework, we need to discipline ourselves to limit our reach. And we need to actually work in these incremental steps. One of the ways we do this, and one of the most important things we can do, is to lower the bar of entry. The traditional development pattern, like I said before, is not perfect. It uses stress and tension to actually have that adaptable emergent order. But one of the things that it did fairly well is it actually allowed a framework where you could start with nothing and end up with something. Today, through all kinds of compassionate reasons, and I respect them, and again, I'm going to be generous to the people who did these things, we have raised the bar of entry to our society. We have said if you want to participate in the game, if you want to play the game, here's the cost of entry. You must have a college degree. You must have 2 cars. You must have the capacity to buy a single family 3,000 square foot home. You must have. And we have this long list of things that you have to be able to do. And if you don't get to play the game. You don't get to participate. You can eke out a living here. And then we have these really frustrating debates about how do we take stuff out of here and bring it back here, not to bring people up, but to just let them keep hanging out here in a way that assuages our conscience in a sense. Wendell Berry talked about subsistence farming, and he said if you don't allow people to subsistence farm, in other words, if you don't allow them to start with nothing, you deny them agency. You deny them the capacity to build something. The traditional development pattern allowed people to start with nothing and build up to something. Let me show you some examples. We call this a tiny house. Our ancestors would have called this a house. Today, we say, if you want to build a tiny house, here's what you have to do. You have these 20 extra requirements that no other house has that you have to meet. You have to go in front of different commissions and councils. You have to go grovel in front of your neighbors and demonstrate that you're not going to destroy their property values and wreck their city. This is how humans always started building their homes. You would start with a small little place. When you saved up enough money, you would put an addition on. When you had a child, you'd put a second story on. When the neighbor came over to help you, you would go over to help them. This is how we iteratively built places for thousands of years. You can go to your older neighborhoods, and what you'll see is that the original house is buried under there somewhere with all these additions on. This is how people built places. When the family lived in the house and the roof would start to go bad, and they didn't have the money to fix it, what would they do? They would go get the money to fix the roof and put an addition on at the same time, and then they rent that addition out to someone and use that revenue to fix the whole thing. You can't do that today. We look back and we see the grand hotels of the past, and we're like, wow, they built these amazing places. Yeah, they were for rich people. Do you know where regular people stayed when they traveled? They stayed in the bedrooms of people they didn't know. People would go out at night and they'd put a little sign out and they'd say, room for rent. And you'd knock on the door at 9 at night and they'd show you to the upstairs room. And you'd give them $2 and they'd let you sleep there. And in the morning they'd give you some food and send you on your way. Can't do that today either. We have taken a lot of tools away from people that allowed them to start with nothing and end up with something. And we've done it in the name of efficiency, in the name of growth, in the name of getting immediate bang for the buck. We see the same thing in commercial properties. This is in Muskegon, Michigan. In Muskegon, you have a rapidly deindustrializing city. You know Muskegon? Something like 80,000 down to like 35,000 people. I mean, huge population loss. Their downtown had a whole ton of retail vacancies. They couldn't get people to fill them. And they recognized that what they had was the bar of entry to the downtown was too high. To fill those buildings, you had to put hundreds of thousands of dollars into new sprinkler systems, completely redo the ADA entries and all these things. I've got a dad who has benefited huge from ADA improvements. I would like buildings, fixed with sprinklers. I'm not saying that these are bad things, but what they do is that if you are a startup entrepreneur, these are massive obstacles to you to get something started. Muskegon is full of poor people, and they recognize that these poor people have to hack their way through life every day. That's where our entrepreneurs are. That's where our crazy people who don't know they can fail are. And we actually need to create a pathway for them to join in this party, in this city. And so what they did, they went out and bought a bunch of storage sheds. They had a gap in their streetscapes. They had an empty block. Remember back to Thigmotaxis? When you have a gap in your streetscape, you lose that edge. People will tend to not walk across there. They wanted to fix that edge condition. So they lined up the storage sheds along there and they rented them out to startup entrepreneurs at like ridiculously cheap prices. Now, if you have a new idea for how to make a different kind of soap or honey or t-shirts or whatever your passion was, you could very, very cheaply and easily go try out your idea and see if you could make it work. These places are full. And there's life and there's energy there. You go there, the people are so friendly, they're excited, they're trying things out. Entrepreneurship is exciting. They're trying to see like what's going to happen. But here's the awesome thing. The core downtown, that's also full of businesses now. And so many of them are graduates from these places. They started here, they got proof of concept, they figured out at a very low risk how to run a business, how to make things work, and they've now graduated to the downtown. These are things we have to do systematically everywhere. We sideline a ton of energy, a ton of capital, a ton of brain power when we raise the bar of entry and don't let people get a start. We have to talk about how we make our public investments. For a long, long time, our theory has been essentially based on the trickle-down notion of investment. If we could make a big investment, that investment would have these spin-off effects that would ultimately affect the people at the base block level. Whether the trickle-down theory was a corporate trickle-down theory or a government trickle-down theory, it was the same kind of top-down, let's do something big and other things will evolve. As if we built the Colosseum so that Rome would appear. Or we built the Eiffel Tower so that we could get Paris. It was the exact opposite, right? Rome was there, then they built the Colosseum. We need to completely invert how we develop projects, how we identify what a good project is. Because today, the best projects out there are not the big transformative ones. They're the little taking care of details kind of thing. We developed a 4-step approach at Strong Towns to making the highest quality public investments we can make. Here's those 4 steps. Step number 1, go out and observe where people struggle. Go out and with humility, observe where people are having a difficult time right now using the city. By humility, and I want to stress humility, What we're trying to suggest here is that you take all the preconceived notions out of your brain of what you think the problem is, what you think the answer should be, and you actually go out there and you try to walk, literally walk with people. Experience the community as they do. Understand the struggles of living in that place, the way the people who are experiencing the struggles experience them. Humility. Step number 2, ask yourself a very simple question. What is the next smallest thing we can do right now to address that struggle? Not what is the ultimate fix, not what is the big thing we can get a grant to do, not what will transform this thing overnight so we never have to worry about this again. What is the next smallest thing we can do right now with paint, a bale of straw, some duct tape, whatever it is? What's the smallest thing we can do right now? Step number 3, go do that thing. Go do it right now. Don't form a committee. Don't study it for 6 months. Don't bring in a consultant. Just go do it. And then step 4 is to repeat that process over and over and over. This very pernicious language has crept into local governments. And I started to hear it around the country in different places, where we refer to the citizens of our community, the residents in our places, we start to refer to them as customers. How's our customer service? Have we improved our customer service this year? What do our customers, are they happy? As if we're all paying taxes to get a service like we're going through a McDonald's drive-thru or something. Jane Jacobs talked about cities as co-creations, as things that we create together. The responsibility we have of living here as citizens, as residents, as members of this municipal corporation is greater than the responsibility that, the people we've elected to be our board of directors have. We have a responsibility to each other. And when we deny people agency, when we deny them the capacity to co-create, we take away something vital. When we go out and humble ourselves to observe where people struggle, when we come up with the next smallest thing we can do and then we go try that, what we do is we create that adaptive feedback loop where we try something small, then people respond to that. Then we can observe that struggle, then we try something small and then people adapt to that. We're allowing our cities to evolve, to emerge, to grow, to become places that actually respond to the needs that humans have in that place. This is a powerful way to do investment because these projects cost very little and they have a massive, massive return. We can continue the mentality that brings us projects like this, the idea that we can grab the latest fad from the APA journal, or we can take the latest thing that we saw when we were on vacation in some other place. If we just did that here, if we just put in fancy decorative lights or blinged out sidewalks or street trees, that it's just going to fix every problem we have. Or we can go out and we can ask some hard questions about where do the humans, our neighbors, living in this place, where do they struggle? Where do they struggle to use what we've been built? And how do we take just basic decent steps right now to address that struggle? When we do this, what we see is amazing things happen. Because our cities are not starved of investment. I was on Capitol Hill a couple days ago at the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And that committee is all about, can we get $1 trillion more or $2 trillion more? We don't lack capital. We lack focus and discipline. These projects don't cost a lot of money. It doesn't cost a lot to actually be of service to others. But if we go out and we humble ourselves to observe where people struggle, if we discipline ourselves to take the next smallest step to address those struggles, if we allow people to respond to that, and then we iterate together and co-create a place, not only can we make the lowest risk, highest returning public investments that is possible to make, we cannot help but improve people's lives in the process. When we humble ourselves, when we go out and observe where people struggle, and when we take these iterative steps, not only are we making low risk, high return investments, financially, we're making ourselves more prosperous, wealthier, better off at very, very low risk. But when we're doing this process, we're improving people's lives. We can't help but make things better for people. And that is the essence of what a Strong Towns approach is. It's bringing those two things together in a powerful way so that we can be of service to each other. Thank you.